Do you think the Old Testament is difficult to understand? Do you want to understand the Bible better on your own? Interpreting the Old Testament begins with understanding the big picture. So in the same way that you can understand the basic contours of a city and how each part of the city works together by flying over the city at 35,000 feet, you can also better understand the Old Testament by looking at it from a very high level so that you can see how all of the parts fit together. So that is what we're going to do in this lesson series. We're going to look at the Old Testament from a very high level. And so the name of the series is The Old Testament from 35,000 Feet. My name is Benjamin Alley. I will be your guide for this series. Have you ever thought, why is it so hard to understand what the Bible is saying? One reason it is difficult to understand what the Bible is saying is very simply our world is very different than the biblical world. And because of this difference, there's a huge gap of understanding. However, all is not lost. There are ways to bridge the gap so that we can understand more of the biblical world and therefore apply that world to our world. The following will provide 4 ways that we can bridge the gap between our world and the biblical world. The first way to bridge the gap is to learn some of the history of the biblical world. To learn the history of the Bible, we have to first learn the sequence of the biblical events in order. In other words, we have to create a timeline of the Bible from beginning to end. Second, we analyze how each event and the biblical text were impacted by the political, social, cultural, and religious influences of that time period. Let me provide an illustration to explain myself. Imagine that you are analyzing the speeches of 2 U.S. presidents. First, we have President George Washington, and second, we have President Barack Obama. Now, even though both of these men have served as the leader of the United States of America, if you analyze the speech, they're going to talk about different ideas and issues. Now, why are the speeches different? One reason the speeches are different is simply because the nation during Washington's time faced different challenges than the nation during Obama's time. So by studying the political, social, cultural, and religious influences of the time in which each president served, one can better understand what each president is saying in his particular speech and why he's saying it. In the same way, the political, social, cultural, and religious climate during Moses' time will cause him to emphasize different issues and ideas in a text written by him than a text written by Daniel over 1,000 years later. So in order to bridge the gap and better understand what the text is saying, we have to understand the history behind the text at each time period. The second way to bridge the gap between our world and the biblical world is to learn some of the geography of the biblical world. The place that you live probably does not look like the land of the Bible. In addition, the writers of the Bible assume that you already know the geography of the Bible. So, for example, if one speaks of the Rocky Mountains in the United States, the typical American will know that it is in the West. In the same way, if one of the biblical writers speaks of a mountain or the desert or cities or places, the writer will expect that we as readers will know where those places are located and what those places look like. So by understanding the geography to which these biblical writers are referring and expect us to understand, you'll be able to bridge the gap and better apply the biblical world to our world. The next way to bridge the gap between our world and the biblical world is to learn some of the culture of the biblical world. If someone mentions McDonald's in our world, we all instantly know that it's fast food. How do we know that? It's because it's food that is part of our culture. It's food that we know about. In the same way, if someone in the biblical world mentions 5 loaves and 2 fish, it's going to bring up ideas of a small little lunch to someone who lived in the first century world. The culture of the biblical world creates this association and meaning, just as our culture creates an association of McDonald's with fast food. Or if someone wears a 3-piece suit to work in our world, we assume that that person perhaps maybe works in an office. We don't assume that that person is a mechanic. Why? Because people in our culture generally wear suits to work if they work in an office. We can assume this fact because we know and understand our own culture. In the same way, when Joseph receives his many-colored coat from his father, it communicated certain ideas in the culture. Specifically, the way that it was made, the colors, it showed that Joseph was very special. The many-colored coat communicates certain ideas about him in the culture of the biblical world, just as a suit communicates in our world that one works in an office and not as a mechanic. Now, it's important to note that there are many cultures that impact the Bible. There's Jewish culture, of course, but there's also Egyptian culture, Assyrian culture, Babylonian culture, Greek culture, and Roman culture, to name a few. If we can understand more about these cultures that impact the Bible, we will better understand the motivations behind people's actions in the Bible. This understanding will in turn help us to bridge the gap between the biblical world and our world. The last way to bridge the gap between our world and the biblical world is to learn some of the language of the biblical world. Our world is made up of many different types of people who speak many different languages. If you're bilingual, you know the challenges of translating from one language to another because you cannot always translate a direct one-to-one correlation into the other language. If you did so, the meaning behind the language would be sometimes incomprehensible. For example, if we were to translate the English phrase "a piece of cake" into another language. Now, if we were saying there is a piece of cake on the table, we could translate it a literal piece of cake. We could say a piece of cake. However, what if the phrase was in a context like this? I finished my homework so fast, it was a piece of cake. What do we mean in that context? Do we mean that the homework was like a literal piece of cake on a table? No, we mean that the homework was very easy. So if we were to translate that phrase in that context to the other language, we wouldn't translate it literally a piece of cake, but rather we would translate the meaning behind what we were saying, so that it's understandable to the person speaking the other language. We would translate it specifically as, my homework was very easy. What I have just described are some of the same challenges that translators of the Bible face. You see, the Bible was originally written in Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic. Different parts of the Bible were written in each of those languages. Now, these languages were translated into the language of the Bible that you read. The Bible that I read is an English Bible. Now, the translators of the Bible have a very difficult job because they must not only translate idioms similar to a piece of cake, they must also decide how to translate deep theological ideas from one language to another. Now, obviously, if you learn Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic, you're going to be able to bridge this gap because then you'll not need to depend upon the translation given to you by someone else. However, learning Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic, that may not be a realistic goal for all of us. So what can we do? Well, number one, we can at least appreciate how translating the Bible from one language to another is complex and perhaps not be so dogmatic about what the text says. In addition, there are ways for those of us who don't know Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic, to use Bible dictionaries or commentaries to learn more about the languages. The more tools we begin to use, you can begin to bridge your gap across our world to the biblical world so that we can apply that world back to our world. So here once again are the 4 ways to bridge the gap between our world and the biblical world. You can bridge the gap by learning more of the history, the geography, culture, and language of the biblical world. The more you understand about these 4 topics, the more you will understand about the biblical world on your own. And the more of the Bible you will be able to apply on your own to your life. What are we going to do in this series, the Old Testament from 35,000 feet? Well, we can't do all 4 of these. Rather, we're going to focus on the top 2. We're going to focus on the history and the geography of the Old Testament. Therefore, each time we meet together for the Old Testament from 35,000 feet, we will have a geography snippet and we will have a history snippet. Now, what do I mean by snippet? I'm using the word snippet to simply mean a very short lesson. Now, for the history snippet, specifically, each time we meet together, we will go through the Old Testament from beginning to end. It will kind of be like an airplane flight where we just want to get a general picture of the landscape of the Old Testament. In addition, each session we're going to do some application, and we'll learn some key principles about our relationship with God that are as relevant today as they were 4,000 years ago during the Old Testament times. Now, what's the goal of this class? I want you, the listeners of these lessons and those who are able to come to class, to better interpret the Bible when you read it on your own. I want you to experience the wonderful insight and change that can come to your life when the Bible simply begins to make sense. So fasten your seatbelts and make sure that your seat backs are up and your tray tables are in their full upright position, because we're about to take off and study the Old Testament from 35,000 feet.